we wanted to do a tiny little compare and contrast between two pieces of criticism our book has received, right? So we've got both a careful analytical review on Amazon that's 2 stars, and we disagree, but it's careful, and we'll talk about that second. And then we have a review. I'm going to put it in quotes, in The Guardian, in which the reviewer appears to have no background in or interest in actual scientific thinking. And let me preface this by saying, actually being having no background in science, effectively being scientifically literate is totally fine. We're all born with scientific capabilities to some degree, with like an interest in exploring what the world is. And for most of us, we don't get exposed to how to think carefully scientifically in school, or it even actually, kills that instinct off in us. And so the fact that most adults are walking around without really a sense of what science is and how it operates isn't damning. And it's unfortunately true. I wish it weren't, but it is. But what is concerning is how many people think that they're being scientific and are actually utterly resistant to any kind of scientific thinking. And part of the blame here goes to the way that social science has evolved over the last 20 or 30 years, right? That this sort of social constructionist view of humanity has become dominant in sociology and anthropology and psychology and in pretty much all the social sciences. And with that has come a complete misunderstanding of what an evolutionary framework is and would do. And so people who engage in social constructionist thinking often imagine that they're doing something careful, but they're not. So one way that we can see that we're not engaging with criticism of a scientific of a scientific sort is when we could see that the conclusion was arrived at before the actual review was written, and when the review was not actually about the thing that it's supposedly reviewing. So here's just one quote from this Guardian review. Haing and Weinstein's advocacy of the still unproven lab leak hypothesis gel nicely with the don't play God, mind the unforeseen consequences, stick to the traditional worldview that the book promotes. So I would just say 2 points to this before you say what you want to say about it, Brett. The idea that this reviewer is bringing up lab leak or anything about COVID at all is points to exactly what I'm saying. This isn't a book about COVID. It was, in fact, the first draft was finished before COVID was a thing. And the idea that has a place in a review that's supposedly about a book tells us right away that this isn't what it appears. It's not a book review. And then the idea that this is a stick to the traditional worldview that this book is promoting suggests either that the reviewer did not in fact read the book, which is quite possible, or that he is willfully either misunderstanding or at least misrepresenting what he does understand to be the case. Because we are quite explicitly not arguing for a traditional worldview, and we say it over and over and over again. So this is either sloppy or anti-scientific, or it reflects a conclusion that was arrived at long before the book was written, which means that this is not a person who should have been put in charge of reviewing such a book.
Well, I think actually I read the review, and I think it implies something even more troubling, if a bit subtle and common. What it implies is that this person is a verificationist, right? Because what our book argues very clearly and explicitly across the entire thing is we cannot go back. We have to go forward. That is dangerous. And we must figure out what that we bring with us from the past is still relevant and useful and what has to be replaced. Now, the problem is if you are a person, a traditionalist, and a verificationist, you will find conservatism in our book. If you are a progressive and an advocate for a different and better world, you will find radicalism in our book. And the idea that one has to balance these things is really what the book is about, right? Mm-hmm. But somebody who's out to deliver a negative review, and this person clearly is. A few clicks reveal that they actually have this position, and either the Guardian knew they were sourcing somebody who would deliver a scathing review, or they didn't know and should have. But either way, that's what they did. But in any case, a verificationist going through the book and finding reason to dismiss it on the basis that, it is about some sort of a conservative traditional worldview tells you that if they read it, they got half of it. But the other thing is, what a fascinating week to deploy this trope about the lab leak, right? Mm-hmm. Because the lab leak, as much as people had realized that it was extremely likely as of, Jon Stewart's beginning to mock it as he did, took another leap. The remainder of the distance was largely covered by the discovery that there had been a grant proposal to introduce exactly the furin site that we find in SARS-CoV-2 that had been delivered by EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak. So we know that this exact change had been proposed. Now, that grant proposal was rejected, but it doesn't matter. The point is, what a week to just press that button. Lab leak conspiracy theory, when in fact all the reasonable people have realized that it was never a dismissible conspiracy theory. It was always viable, and there's an awful lot of evidence for it.
Well, it seems to me there's an analogy here that not only is a lot of sort of this person who I imagine is sort of immersed in woke world and in social constructionist world. So much of that world is actually biologically essentialist in a way that an actual understanding of human evolution would not support. And similarly, this so-called progressive world is actually highly reliant on authorities and institutions that are pretending to speak truth, but actually coming to conclusions behind closed doors and never showing us the analysis. And so, part of what we're doing, and we've been doing for a while now on the show, is not so much in the last couple of months we've been focused on the book, but looking at analyses and assessing whether or not those analyses make sense. And part of the reason that we find ourselves out of step with some of what is being promoted as public health policy right now is that almost nothing that has emerged during this pandemic from public health officials or the CDC, the WHO, whatever, comes with a description of the analysis that was done. Sometimes there are some references to data sets, but the actual analysis is elided. It is hidden. It is obscured, which is exactly antithetical to science. Not just the results of science need to be in public view, but the actual scientific process. And so the analyses that we've been relying on as we come to conclusions that are wildly out of step sometimes with what some public health officials would say are exactly that. They're analyses in which we can actually look at and assess the analyses done. So that's what scientists do.
Right. That's what scientists do. And, you make the point that a review can't start with its conclusion. It's not a valid review. And you can say the exact same thing about science. I don't care how sophisticated your, measurement apparatus was. I don't care how fancy the laboratory. I don't care what degree you have. If you started with a conclusion and worked backwards from it, it's not only not science, it's the opposite of science, right? Yep. A review that starts with its conclusion isn't a review.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, a review, you could imagine a review that's written, which did not begin the book with the conclusion, but now that they're writing it, they've come to the conclusion. But so, a reviewer who approaches the book that they are supposed to be reviewing already with their conclusion in their head is not capable of writing a review. The
process of review, right? You have to be open to the possibility that there's something there before you declare that it's absent.
That's right. So let's just talk a little bit about this, this 2-star review on Amazon by a guy named Ryan Boissonneau, whose name I'm unfortunately probably butchering here. Let me see if I can pull it up.
We were watching the book go live and reviews show up, and someone called our attention to this review. It was the first negative review, and I went and read it, and I thought, actually, it's wrong. I think I know why it's wrong, but the person did an honest, they made an honest attempt at evaluating it. They reached a conclusion that I think is actually very much the beginning of an important discussion.
This is what a review of the book should look like that is negative, right? Yep. So obviously we disagree, because if we didn't, we wouldn't have written the book that we did, right? So, we have lots of reviews. We have many, I can't. Okay, sorry guys. we have many reviews that are positive and careful and reflective of what's in the book, and there's one negative review that feels to us like what a negative review should sound like. So let's talk about. So he basically disagrees, and you can take my screen off now, Zach. The title of the review is "Culture Does Not Exist to Serve the Genome," which is him pushing back against the one of the theoretical concepts that we introduce in the book. Right, this is not already out there in the scientific literature. This is new with us, which we introduced in the first chapter, which is the omega principle. And we can understand why you might not agree with the omega principle, but as we have argued elsewhere, if you don't, you have to explain then what culture is. And if you're simply black boxing culture and saying it can't possibly be evolutionary, it can't possibly be serving genetic ends, then you are taking it on faith. That's basically a faith-rich argument.
So
maybe we should say what it is.
So the omega principle is a two-part principle. Yeah. Basically, we choose omega because it's a Greek letter. It's supposed to evoke pi, which specifies the precise relationship between the diameter and circumference of a circle. And likewise, omega specifies what we say is the precise relationship, the obligate relationship between culture and other epigenetic phenomena on the one hand, and the genome on the other. And the relationship is epigenetic phenomena evolve more rapidly, they're more adaptable, but they are obligated to the objectives of the genome. That is, they serve the genome's ends. And this is indeed a very provocative claim. Now, I will say something even more provocative here, which is that, of course, you would get some pushback on this, right? Because the implications of this principle are so profound that they really change everything. For most creatures, it doesn't change your evolutionary analysis. It doesn't have almost anything to say about, at least as far as culture goes, obviously it doesn't have anything to say about plants or fungi or most animals. But as you get to humans, it changes everything about the meaning of what we are and how we ended up this way. And so if we are incorrect about this, it actually renders a huge amount of the analysis that we do in the book wrong. But we are not incorrect. We show our work. And
I don't actually even think that's true.
I was expecting a little pushback, but the reason that it is
because there's so much else in the book that is consistent with mismatch hypothesis or scientism as replacing scientific thinking or reductionism and over reliance on metrics. All of which are everything that we do is consistent with one or more of those, but there's plenty that doesn't actually rely on omega, although omega is consistent with everything that we talk about in the book.
No, I would say it differently. I would say there are many things in the book that are true irrespective of omega, but that the central idea, right, is predicated on the basis that our apparatus for generating culture, the conscious apparatus that then generates culture, is consistent with an evolutionary analysis, that it is not the cultural layer in conflict with the genetic layer. Mm-hmm. It may be that our ancient culture is out of step with our current environment, but it is not that our culture is out of step with our genome.
Yeah, no, I see this. So, mismatch hypothesis, which has been discussed by many people, might be, absent an understanding of omega principle, be imagined to be, this is just the derangement that modernity brings us because, culture. And we are trying to explain something more consistently, more deeply by saying, well, yes, culture, but culture is itself, at least that culture, which is long-standing and expensive to maintain or create and variable in extent, is itself inherently an adaptation.
Right. So the point is, this principle is going to end up being right. And the reason that we know it's going to end up being right is that the logic that explains why it has to be right is actually not complex at all. Right. The fact is, a cultural brain is the product of a genome, which puts the genes in a perfect position to shut it down if it isn't serving the genome's ends. And what the step people miss is it's impossible for cultural stuff to be cost free. Right. Mm-hmm. Cultural stuff that has you doing something is wasting the time and energy of the genome. Cultural stuff that forbids you from doing something is limiting opportunities. So these things are costly to the genome. And therefore, for the genome to have facilitated a mind that gets filled with this stuff, it has to have on average paid.
Yeah.
Right. So That said, once you get to that step, right? This is something 1976 Dawkins introduces mimetic evolution. It's a brilliant introduction, but he makes what we claim is an error. He says culture is a new primeval soup. It's basically a new tree of life. Cultural phenomena evolve. He argues correctly, but he's arguing that they are evolving independent of the layer that they ride on top of. And were that true, it describes a very complex and, in fact, a landscape that can't even really be analyzed because many things hover between layers, right?
Yeah.
Language has both phenomena in it. It has purely cultural stuff and it has a genetic underpinning. What do you make of that evolutionarily if these two things are independent? On the other hand, if they're both serving genetic ends, then you can analyze this. And the point is, whoa, a whole bunch of stuff that is paradoxical if we treat it as independent of the genome is no longer paradoxical. It becomes tractable if we approach these things with this assumption.
Yeah. I'm reminded, so we have a section at the very end, recommended further reading, where we recommend a couple of books unrelated to our own work that we have learned from and that speak to some of the issues in that chapter. And so at the very end, we say more technical texts that are nonetheless excellent include, and one of the two here is this Jablonka and Lamb text, and I would have pulled up the book, but it's not in this room right now, from 2014 called Evolution in Four Dimensions, Genetic, Epigenetic, Behavioral, and Symbolic Variation in the History of Life. This is an extraordinary book. It's super dense. It's not easygoing, even for us. I once tried to just give us sort of a page-long excerpt to freshmen, and it didn't go over too well. Advanced undergraduates would have been different, but it's dense. I'll warn you, but it's truly a terrific book. But the title, Genetic, Epigenetic, Behavioral, and Symbolic something in the Evolution of Life, suggests that would seem to imply that these are different things. And so I'm sorry if I missed it, but I think one thing you didn't say in your description of Omega Principle this time is that we are talking about genetic phenomenon, and everyone has a pretty decent model of what that means, and then epigenetic phenomenon. And epigenetic just means above the genome. And back when we were in grad school, it actually was used in this sensu lato way, this broad way, to mean anything that was above the level of the genome that could impact the genome. And then in modern times, most people, including many biologists, but certainly most non-biologists, when they hear epigenetic, they assume that what you're talking about is molecular mechanisms, which is a very sensu stricto, a very narrow sense of what epigenetic might mean. So things like DNA methylation. And what we argue is that we have circumscribed our understanding of epigenetics to our peril, that there are things like culture that are epigenetic sensu lato, that are just as much downstream of genetics and also ultimately serving genetic ends.
So not only downstream, but the shocking thing, the part that still surprises me is that actually the analogy between something like culture and something like these molecular mechanisms that regulate gene expression actually do belong very much in the same category because they do the same thing, right? So if you think about it, for those of you who are not experienced with it, these molecular mechanisms regulate which genes get expressed where. And so you have...
And when.
Right, where and when. So the fact that your eyes and your eye cells and your liver cells look very different despite having the same genome is the result of the fact that there are these molecular...
To some degree how too, actually, sorry. But,
right, but
yeah.
Anyway, it allows you to be a complex organism rather than just a puddle of like cells, right? And so that is
good for most of us.
It's pretty darn great.
Yeah,
and so,
I'm enjoying it.
So, imagine that we recently figured out this landscape enough to begin talking about how that process works. So this is the last several decades. And you can imagine that there would be a lot of excitement about that because, a single genome doesn't an organism make, but the separate regulation allows all sorts of things to unfold. I mean, including two genomes that are alike, but express one as a male and one as a female, right? These are all epigenetically regulated phenomena. But that excitement about what the epigenetic regulators of genes do obscures this other thing, which is specifically relevant to humans. And the point is, culture regulates the expression of genes too, right? It regulates the fact that your body will be in church on Sunday morning or, not, right? Those sorts of things. So the point is, it's still shaping the way the genome is expressed in the world, which is why it subscribes to the same rule. Okay, go ahead.
Well, slight pivot. I was just, I'm very interested, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the, we continue to do lots of interviews, sometimes multiple ones a day, and it's going to continue on into the future, for which we are grateful. Although it's super fascinating to see how different the approach of, say, professional scientists is when they talk to us about the book, as opposed to people with audiences that don't at least understand themselves to be scientific at all. And one of the places where this happened to just be me was on the Jim Rutt podcast, and we talked about this a little bit last week. But I was particularly taken with this quote from his show notes, just to reflect. And this is not his description of our book, but his description of his and my conversation about the book. And this is, of course, not a complete list, but in his show notes for the show that he and I did together. And again, Jim is himself a scientist. Yes.
Yeah, he's a complexity scientist.
Yeah.
I mean, not by degree, but by professional history.
Former head of the Santa Fe Institute, et cetera. Quote, they, meaning Jim and me, discuss hypernovelty and its challenges, niche switching as the human niche, the naturalistic fallacy, the ancient Beringians' entry into the Americas, the hubris of reductionism and neo-cornucopianism, humans as the blankest slates, metaphorical and literal campfires, scaling laws and social groups, theory of mind, social media's flattening effects, including flattened affects, social media sabbaticals, the sucker's folly, something we introduce in the book, human population explosion, the personal responsibility vortex, which is from an earlier TED Talk of yours, Brett, proto-bee communities, the lineage view of evolution, understanding exponentials and fat tail events, culture as evolutionary adaptation, the Omega Principle, again, something we introduce in the book, humanity's fourth frontier, again, something we introduce in the book. So that's, I just love that list. It's an accurate and yet still not complete list of the conversation that Jim and I had. And it's certainly not a complete telling of what it is that we cover in this book. And so, part of the challenge for people who would hate on us and this book is that it's really, really hard to pigeonhole us. And the idea that the book is filled with pseudoscience because we have ideas in it that haven't been vetted by other people, well, that is, of course, what science does.